Welcome to My Therapist Says, an interactive experience enriching your most important relationships. I'll be your host and moderator as we present Sexual Betrayal, the Phases of Couple Recovery. During this broadcast, I'm joined by Aaron Reinecke and Denise Arrow, both licensed marriage and family therapists and certified sex therapists. In a few moments, these two therapists will provide helpful steps to couples successfully recovering from sexual betrayal. Today's event takes place before a live audience and live streaming while offering biblical and practical solutions. It's like having your own Christian mental health relationship doctor within the comforts of your living room. I hope you will sit back and relax and take in these life-changing insights. Please join me as we connect with a live audience and My Therapist Says. Well, would you join me in welcoming, actually, they're going to do this in tandem, and that is Aaron Reinecke and Denise Arrow, who are both licensed marriage and family therapists and have really large practices, each of them, in their work, in their clinical work here in San Diego. So would you please join me in welcoming both of them this evening?
Well, I want to thank Don and the church for inviting us here tonight. And can you, there I go. And actually, we have a handout, and most of you got it probably when you were coming in, but if you didn't get it, just raise your hand, and we'll have somebody bring you one. And they're out in the foyer, just outside that center door. So, Mike, maybe you can make that happen. That'd be great. Oh, he's got them right there. Well, tonight we're going to be talking about sexual betrayal, and this is an action that's nearly universally condemned, of course. Art, film, and literature across time and culture are replete with this painful theme. And Jesus himself said that it was really the one clear condition under which divorce would be permitted. Marriage is sacred. Relationships are sacred. And sexual betrayal can be a death sentence to relationship. Now, the definitions and subtleties of sexual betrayal can vary from culture to culture. However, no matter what your income level, your politics, your faith perspective, when you get cheated on, it's like the worst of all experiences. Just ask Beyonce or Ed Sheeran or Sandra Bullock or many of us right here in this room. Before Denise and I share a few comments very briefly about the phases of recovery for couples, I want you to hear something. Ready? Even though the pain and trauma and shame of sexual betrayal is great, the opportunity to experience redemption as an individual and couple is even greater. Really good things often come out of really bad experiences. And it usually takes longer than we want it to, but it can happen. Now look, you can't control your partner's work, or even if he or she is going to do any work or wants to work on the relationship. But nevertheless, you can choose to accept the wisdom that regardless of what eventually occurs in the relationship, this season can work to your advantage if you press in and do the hard work and suffering that it requires. And we see that miracle happen with couples all the time. Now, I may occasionally refer to the betrayer as he and the betrayed as she. That's not always the way it is, but most of the time with my clients, that's the way it is. I'm working more so with the men, although I do work with women as well. Okay, so first of all, first phase is the discovery and the disclosure phase. And I'm going to talk a little bit about it from the betrayed side, from the betrayer side, and then Denise is going to talk about it from the betrayed side. Now, discovery happens and the pain begins. The secret is out. This is when the half-truths start. Just enough is admitted to, so the spouse's understandable outrage, you try to placate it. And then another round of questions begin, maybe later that day, maybe the next day, and the whole process continues. And just enough information, often is the case, it's just shared enough information to satisfy him or her for that moment. This process can go on and on and on, and the whole time of staggered disclosure, as we call it, is like ripping off the Band-Aid again from a deep wound that is continually getting worse. Now, in contrast to that, preparation for a therapeutic disclosure calls a halt to this hellish process and calls the betrayer to do some soul searching and take complete responsibility by fully and empathically sharing the extent of the betrayal. Now, to prepare for that, it takes time because there's a lot of work that needs to happen inside of the betrayer in order for him or her to do that well. And so sometimes that's weeks, sometimes it's months of time before a really good therapeutic disclosure can occur.
So meanwhile, the betrayed is experiencing what we call the emotional roller coaster, right? It's a horrible, horrible stage where one moment you're feeling hope and the next it's complete despair and the next it's rage and then confusion and then pain and anxiety and then back to hope again. And that can all happen within 10 minutes. It's quite an emotional roller coaster, and it's really difficult for the betrayed to experience that. But living by faith includes living with emotions because we are all made in the image of God, and that's part of being a human. But how much information is too much information, right? Because too much information can definitely increase the pain and increase, a lot of unnecessary trauma. So basically, the rule of thumb is that, basic info is helpful, but the devil is in the details. So too many details or even details at all really don't help the situation. It can replay in the betrayed's brain for years with traumatizing effects. I call it picking through the vomit, right? We don't need to do that. I like the verse in Proverbs 24:3. It says, "Guard your heart, for out of it pour the well springs of life," right? So in that verse, what they mean by heart is your thoughts. And so for the betrayed, they really need to guard what they hear, guard their thoughts, even though part of their brain may be demanding that they get attention. Being intentional in limiting the amount of information is really helpful in the long run.
So second phase is taking ownership and then the personal growth that comes with that. A betrayer develops a narrative, always develops some narrative by which he or she can justify this behavior because they know it's wrong, but somehow they have to develop a story inside their own head that justifies it. So it can sound something like to them inside their head, if only she wasn't so cold to me, what's a man to do? Or if only he wasn't so controlling, he doesn't really love me. So these are just a couple of quick examples of the ways in which these narratives begin and develop. And now, if it was an affair that included emotional bonds and connections, those have to be discovered. They have to, by the betrayer, really doing this introspection to really understand how these bonds developed. How did it? Often I ask, what was the first mistake you made? And the guy I'm working with will often say, well, we did, and he talks about the sexual act in some way. And then I say, oh, okay. So then I probe a little deeper, and a little bit later he's realizing, well, no, actually the first mistake was, the day before, or the week before, or the month before, or 6 months before. And so coming to understand how emotional bonds develop and can lead to sexual bonds is really, really important, and they have to be discovered, admitted, owned, renounced, and forsaken. And all of that takes time and work. Then, and only then, is the soul free to learn to develop new emotional and eventually sexual bonds with the real partner. Now, with others, it's not really an affair. It's more of a case of compulsion and perhaps addiction. And it's maybe it's physical, maybe it's porn. It can be a lot of different things, but it's still betrayal. And there can be deep withdrawal effects as the betrayer shuts down unhealthy sexual and emotional pleasure-centered neural pathways. Now, that process of stopping the behavior and shutting it down is a very difficult one. And then, but only then, can the brain be alive enough to begin to recapture its ability to experience pleasure and satisfaction in healthier ways. And we see this all the time, but I had to go through this myself in my own soul many years back with my porn addiction. I am helping guys go through the very same process that I went through myself. And I probably should have gone on antidepressants at the time. I really should have, but I was too stubborn, and I just didn't want to do that. And it's not always necessary, for everybody. It isn't. But sometimes the anxiety and the depression that comes up is really, really strong.
So, for the betrayed, when your exterior world collapses, reinforce the interior world, right? So how do we do that? How do you reinforce the interior world? And there's basically like 4 basic things. And one of them is to allow yourself to grieve, because the only way to heal is really to let yourself feel. So grief is a big one. The next one is faith, pressing into God. This is really your lifeline. I don't know how non-Christians get through it. I really don't. But I will tell you this, Lisa TerKeurst has a wonderful book, and it's called This Isn't the Way It's Supposed to Be. And that's a whole book about how to press into God during, sexual betrayal. It's a great book. So this process can stir up old pain and old mistreatment from years past and even childhood. So part of the way that you reinforce the interior world is you begin to discover the negative scripts inside your brain, and you begin to, as the Bible would call it, renew your mind, right? And lastly, learning healthy boundaries, not just for other people, but even for yourself. Learning to have those boundaries with yourself. And we discussed earlier being intentional about, caring for yourself and how much you allow yourself to hear. So the good news is there is a silver lining. I like to say that God likes to give beautiful gifts in really ugly wrapping paper. Romans 8:28 sort of, speaks to that. But some good things that can be birthed that I often see with my clients in the therapy room is honest, healthy communication is something that creates connection. And this process almost forces you to begin to learn how to communicate in an honest, healthy way. Also, restructuring the relationship. There are no perfect people, there are no perfect relationships, but we could all use help sometimes improving a relationship. Creating new beginnings, new patterns. Lastly, one of the silver linings is, I notice this a lot with my clients, they become a wounded healer. They'll come in towards the end of therapy and say, gosh, I was asked to speak at this group, or as I am here today, or gosh, I ran into somebody and God is really using this for good in my life. So it's a journey nobody wants to go on, but it's a great journey. And in the end, Most of my clients say, I wouldn't have ever wished this on my worst enemy, but I also wouldn't have missed the growth that I got from it.
So, thirdly is forgiveness. On the betrayer side, he must face the very real shame and guilt of the betrayal and not blame the spouse or get trapped in the subtle web of self-blame, shame, and unworthiness. And that's a lot easier said than done. Shame is very subtle, it's very tricky. And it can go back, as Denise was alluding to, it can go back years and decades into childhood. And sometimes the Lord uses a really difficult time like this to bring to light things that he wants to heal you from a long time back. But it's so easy for us to avoid all of that pain and rather just blame our spouse, as I was talking about in the last little section, or blame ourselves, and just really do more than blame ourselves. It's just that we can really run ourselves down so much that it's really unhealthy, and it gets in the way of our own healing. So the betrayer must forgive himself. The identity of the betrayer must be reconstructed so that he can legitimately face the facts of his past actions, but also see himself as worthy of a good future. You have to have the courage to face the truth about what you've done, and that can empower you to begin to see yourself as a person that is worthy of a good future. Can the betrayer understand truths about himself, such as, even though I am flawed, I am still worthy of love? In my own recovery, that was something that I held on to, and I the way that I said it to myself was a little different, but it was the same idea. And I will often help my client to see in his own life story where and how this or a similar identity statement has been actually lived out and has been true for him or her. And if it was true then, it can be true now.
So Aaron, you made a point about shame a second ago, and something that just kind of popped into my mind that I wanted to kind of build on with that is that the betrayer's shame can block connection with the betrayed. So it's a big roadblock in the healing of a relationship for both partners. Any other thoughts about that? Or?
Yeah, I saw that in my own life, that as I did that, gosh, that hard work to face the truth of what I did, and really that's when the gospel just became so real to me in a deeper way than ever, because I knew that, boy, I was a sinner, and yet I was able to really receive some really deep forgiveness from God and some men around me, and eventually from my wife as well. And it was, but my wife could only really truly forgive me as she worked through her own pain. She couldn't do it before that, and she couldn't do it before she saw that I was really changing, that I was becoming someone that she could trust. But we'll get into that here pretty soon, that part.
So true awareness of feelings is a prerequisite for forgiveness. A lot of people want to kind of bury their head in the sand and not deal with the feelings. But it's okay to be human, it's okay to have feelings, and it's good to deal with the feelings. And the truth of the matter is, if you're waiting for your feelings to feel like forgiving, it's never going to happen. And so although you need to feel the feelings initially and go through the emotions, actual forgiveness is a choice. It's a decision. I think it's also our reasonable service to God as believers. So releasing the person really entails giving up my right to hurt you back. And it takes a little bit of time. It takes a little bit of time to get to that place. So some things that forgiveness is not, it's not forgetting, right? Because if we could forget, we wouldn't need to forgive. It's not minimizing or excusing behaviors. I love what the Serenity Prayer says. It says, accepting hardship as the pathway to peace. And I'm telling you, when I was able to finally forgive, the peace I felt was phenomenal. So accepting, hardship as the pathway to peace. That's a really huge thing. Also, it's also not releasing them from accountability. They're still accountable. They still have to do their work. They still, have to create safety in the relationship again. So it's not releasing them from that either.
So next, it's rebuilding trust and emotional safety. And the betrayers often want to rush to this phase, like real fast. Well, I already heard you. How many times are you going to tell me the same thing? I get it. I get it. I'm sorry. And can't we just, rebuild now? And we got to, forget the past, and we have to move. If I had literally a dime, well, maybe $1, for every time I heard something like that, I would be so rich, you wouldn't believe how rich I would be. $1, yeah. Dime, okay. But I don't want to exaggerate. But your spouse, I want to say this to those of you that are working on this. Your spouse does not have a trust problem. He doesn't, she doesn't. You have a trustworthiness problem. And it's your privilege, it's your responsibility to demonstrate to her or to him that you're changing. And it's in every small little way that your word has to mean something. Your life has to be consistent. It must. Or you'll just be stuck for a long time. And you don't have to be perfect. When you blow it, years ago, I forgot to get something at the grocery store on the way to the house. And so my wife, she said, Aaron, it's good to see you. Hey, where's the milk, I'll say. And I said, oh, I forgot it in the car. I forgot it in the car. And I was just lying. Because I was like, why would I lie about some small thing like that? It's fine. But I lied, and then she said, well, you better go get it. We got to get in the refrigerator. And then I even started taking a step towards the door to go to the garage. And then I thought, I'm never going to get to the store and back before she's going to ask me the next question, why were you in the garage so long? Okay? And I just this is silly. It's ludicrous. And I just was able to tell her the truth right then. And so it's so important for us to look. You don't have to be perfect. You just have to admit when you've blown it. That's what you have to do, and you have to do it quickly. And don't let your wife or husband catch you. You have to admit it. All right. So your goal is to demonstrate to your spouse that you are the one who can now be trusted. You can also be relied on to carry, this is so important, to carry this burden of pain with her instead of trying to encourage her to get through it. Come on, you can just, you have to go right out and meet her inner pain and carry the pain with her. Bear one another's burdens and so fulfill the law of Christ. Be Christ to her in that way. That's how you're going to change it. betrayers can form a new paradigm about the pain that is shared with them. You know, I remember, it being shared with me, and it was just like, oh, it was just like so heavy because I was ashamed of myself. I was living in shame, and it was so hard. But I began to change that way of thinking, and I began actually to think, here's an opportunity for me to demonstrate that I value her and the pain that I caused. I can validate that pain. I can be with her in her pain, and I value that more than my own personal emotional comfort, because I would just like pull away so fast. So we have to lean into the pain rather than lean away from it and avoid it. So years ago, 15, 20 years ago, I was listening to a radio broadcast, and this woman was on there. She was describing her experience in a Nazi concentration camp. And she was a survivor. She survived, obviously, and she married an American serviceman. They moved to the United States. And unfortunately, 10 years later, they went through a divorce. And I'm kind of half listening. And so far, so good. I get. Then she said, the pain of the divorce was worse than the pain of the concentration camp. And then I was like, what? All of a sudden, I'm fully engaged. And then the next thing she said is, I expected the Nazis to betray me, but I didn't expect my husband to betray me. And then I got it. I understood. You know, there's only one thing worse than going through a hellish experience, a hellish time, and that is going through it alone. So I actively teach the guys I'm working with and the women I'm working with how to be with their partners going through this, rather than two individuals going through it alone.
So for the betrayed, trying to trust is a crisis. And I usually teach them to trust and verify, right? In the beginning, at least, until there's sufficient trust built. Trust building takes a while. It's not a quick process. The betrayed want to trust, and they usually say in therapy, oh my gosh, I hate this. It feels horrible that I can't trust. It's miserable to me. So they're motivated. They want to. They're just looking for the little things they need to begin to build, like building blocks again. So the betrayer, keeping their promises, being proactive to tell the truth, those kinds of things are huge. And I will tell you, in the therapy room, when the betrayed come in, and they'll come in sometimes and say, this was a great week. He admitted this to me, or he told me that. He didn't have to tell me that. I wouldn't have known. I wouldn't have known that he looked at porn again. And we high five. It's great. It's great to see the progress, right? But trust must be earned. And indiscriminately extending trust can set the betrayed up for even more pain, which we really want to avoid at this point, because oftentimes they're traumatized as it is. So what we work on is learning to say back to the betrayer, until I know that you are trustworthy, I'm going to be verifying, right? And the betrayer will often say back, great, that's good, I understand that. It's a group process, it's a couple process to rebuild that trust. So the betrayed need two things in order to restore trust after betrayal. One of them is safety. That's both emotional safety and physical safety. And the other is voluntary truth, right? So one of the things that I suggest to the betrayed that I work with is to sit down with the betrayer and have a conversation, come up with some boundaries together. So such as if maybe the betrayer runs into an affair partner, how he's going to handle that, or she's going to handle that, and what's going to happen with that. those little things go a long way in rebuilding trust and creating the intimate connection that we're looking to begin to rebuild again after a sexual betrayal. So, thank you all for having us, and these are the 4 phases of dealing with sexual betrayal. And yeah, Aaron, do you have anything to add to that?
No, I think I'm ready for some questions.
Okay.
All right. Would you join me in thanking both of them for their wonderful presentation? Thank you. Thank you. And I know we have some questions, and Bob could help us. So would you raise your question in the air, your 3x5 card? There's several here that have raised their hand. We'll bring those to the front. And I'd like to give just a little more introduction to our guests here this evening. Denise Arrett is a licensed marriage and family therapist and practices at Denise Arrett Marriage and Family Therapy with offices in Mission Valley and Rancho Bernardo. Denise is a certified sex addiction therapist, and she enjoys helping the betrayed and partners of sex addicts find healing and wholeness after the devastation of betrayal. And Aaron Reinecke is a licensed marriage and family therapist since 1990. He has specialized in treating sexual addicts and their spouses for the past 3 decades. He enjoys digging wells in villages around the world that previously had no clean drinking water, attempting new epic bike rides and climbing mountains. He's married to Dr. Melinda Reinecke. They have 5 adult children. So we're really glad to have both of you here and for sharing this with us. And we do have several questions, but I wanted to start, if I may, with some of what you were talking about, this idea of shame. Shame is so devastating. Could you give us a simple understanding of what shame means, and from a biblical perspective, how we can receive forgiveness? Because it seemed to be the very foremost piece that you were talking about. So could you help us? What is shame? Could you describe this, of course, in this context, if we could?
Sure. You know, Denise, when you said that it's often the betrayer's shame that keeps them from having an opportunity to really connect with his partner.
Yep.
So shame is what keeps you from being able to connect in a healthy way with the people around you. Mm-hmm. Because you don't, on some level, you don't feel worthy of that connection. So shame is about, it's like guilt is feeling bad about what you've done, and shame is feeling bad about who you are. And it can become such a part of you that it's hard to shake. It's hard to let go of. And I remember back in my own life, what I got in touch with was early on in my family, just feeling so bad about wanting to please my parents so much, but it was just hard. It was really hard, and it always seemed like it just was out of my grasp, and I really began to feel like I'm just not good enough. I'm not worthy of being loved just as I am, and so that's a bit about shame. Do you have something, Denise, you'd like to add?
Yeah, I think sometimes when partners or the betrayed are in a lot of pain, they want to really let them have it, and so sometimes it's those shameful words, but that really blocks the growth and the healing process. I like the verse that says, "For there is now no condemnation for those in Christ Jesus." So part of what we do in groups is we work on being able to express those feelings in a healthy way without shaming, because shaming will block the healing of the relationship.
So when we talk about the difference between shame and expressing core feelings, what I really feel because of this, you could say, when I experienced knowing that you betrayed me, that I feel angry, embarrassed, afraid, whatever the core feeling may be, and then the other person validate that. That moves you away from dual shame, shaming the other person, feeling shame, because we all have core feelings. So that's what I'm hearing The difference, we don't really see in the Bible where God shames anyone. If you think about it, He's created us in His image. So we are beautiful creations. However, we should feel badly that we've sinned, and that does create shame, because we tend to, when we're shamed, we tend to isolate and hide. I was working with a patient today. The tendency for this person with the addiction is to hide, is to go and actually use the porn. And usually when there's a lot of anxiety that arises, that will happen. So it's important to look at this idea of shame. And I think you were saying this, that the betrayer's shame can block the betrayed. Am I correct? That's how that was said? Maybe I misquoted.
It can block the betrayed's ability to feel heard and understood.
Okay, to feel heard and understood. Okay. Which understanding is really the important piece here, to be understood by both people. Okay, so this says this. Here's one of our questions. It's directly from the audience, and I have several texted questions as well. How do you get over the doubt that your significant other is not going to go back to the sexual addiction behind your back? This seems to be a paramount question. How do you get over the doubt that your significant other will not go back to the sexual addiction behind your back?
Well, I think there's always, if we're honest, there's always some level of doubt in life. I have it in my relationship with God from time to time. I deal with doubt sometimes. It's a human experience. What can we know of for absolute certain while we're here on earth? Very few things. Gravity is probably always going to be, a constant, but doubt is a part of life. Okay, so it's not just doubt in relationship to this experience and your spouse, but I came to a place in my recovery where I recognize that from some early childhood stuff that I didn't really feel very good about myself. And I worked on those things, and I got a measure of relief. But another part of my relief came as I made changes in the present to become a man of His Word, and a man that could be trusted by my wife. And as I made those changes, and I was really serious about it, and I worked my fanny off, I think I can say that word, I worked really, really hard, then she noticed it. And she started responding slowly. And when she started verbalizing some of the feedback to me about how important those changes were, I felt like $1 million, because I had done something really difficult. I had changed something really difficult, and it made a difference to the person that I loved the most on planet Earth. And my view of myself just kept growing and growing and growing.
So you're talking about the idea of being trustworthy. That's what you're saying. And you were also talking about voluntary truth. That is very helpful. Where a lot of people even get hurt worse is when they're found out, rather than admitting. It's so different when that happens. So you were talking, Denise, about safety and voluntary truth, that helps in the process. Am I correct?
So almost every partner, could have written that question.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
There's a lot of anxiety, a lot of fear about being hurt again. We often talk about reasonable safety. And so if you're married to a person who struggles with porn addiction or sex addiction, reasonable safety would be them doing their groups, them doing their work. You would see patterns of honesty You'd see increasing honesty. You'd see some certain things, and that would create some reasonable safety. Sometimes fears are just not reasonable, right? They're unfounded sometimes. But if you're married to a sex addict, there is always the possibility that they could have a slip up or they could act out again. So reasonable safety is sort of what we aim for.
Okay. You talk about kind of betrayals, like multiple betrayals. This next question talks about that. You're building trust, you're moving forward, and then there's another betrayal. The question from our audience, one of the persons is, are the phases of recovery, which you just presented, are the phases of recovery different for multiple betrayals?
I don't think they're probably different. It's just longer. And by that, what I'm saying is that if there's a betrayal and a disclosure is done and everything is out and it's clear what has happened, and in that one disclosure there can be, multiple problems within that disclosure. Okay. And then if you're going through the process, but then the healing process, but then there's a relapse and there's another major problem that occurs, then that really shakes. It would shake anybody. And so then in some ways you have to begin the process again, and the whole process can take longer, of course. So what do you have to add to that, Denise?
Well, I think it depends on what the issue is. If they're committing adultery repeatedly, that's kind of a dangerous thing, and that's putting yourself in harm's way. Mm-hmm. So the response to that would be probably much different than if it was, looking at porn or something like that. Yeah.
I think the next question ties into this as we're talking about. This is a text question. How do you build trust after a staggered disclosure when the spouse doesn't believe that everything that has happened? So the spouse is not believing everything that has happened. Let me read it again if I may. How do you build trust after a staggered disclosure when the spouse, in other words, that's not the voluntary giving full disclosure, so it's staggered disclosure, when the spouse doesn't believe that everything that is everything that has happened?
Yeah, where there's doubt that maybe he hasn't really come clean, or
Yeah.
she hasn't really come clean. The betrayer maybe is holding on to information. Mm-hmm. Now, I talk to my guys often about, you could voluntarily take a polygraph, and you could do that, and that could really help your wife. In this case, your wife. Really believe that you've shared everything that there is to share. And we've been using polygraphs in some cases, not all of them. Sometimes the wife doesn't want a polygraph, or doesn't feel like she needs one, or, whatever. There's different reasons. But we often use them, and we've been using them for 20 years or so. And they've been very, very helpful. Polygraph, it depends on the polygraph examiner, but we have a very good polygraph examiner that we refer to, and it's been helpful to hundreds of our clients.
And what is your experience? I've had people and read some about this as well, and had my own patients with a lie detector test or polygraph, which is one of the questions. What about lie detectors test? That's one of the text into questions. How much do you use that in your process, the information from it? How do you use it so that it's valuable to the healing of both people?
It really is a case-by-case basis.
Okay.
And I suggest it to the betrayer. When I believe that it could really be helpful, then I suggest it to the betrayer, because and it's better for him to bring it to her and offer it than for her to demand it. of him. But I don't see that as necessary in every case, because sometimes the relationship, it just is so case dependent. It's hard to say any more about it than that, I think.
Okay.
Yeah, so with partners, those polygraphs can be really helpful. It can be really healing. Oftentimes the partners have high levels of trauma, and so a polygraph sort of, helps them have something tangible to hang on to, and they'll often come back after a polygraph and say, oh, he was telling the truth. I feel like I can move forward. I feel like I can kind of let go of some of my fear. Sometimes with couples, the polygraph to me is a godsend. Sometimes with couples, the sex addict has been clean for a long time and the partner just is too frightened, too traumatized to accept it. And so the polygraph can, kind of bring some clarity. And so it's been really healing in my experience.
So we're working kind of on the topic right now of how much information to share, what kind of information to get, how to build trust, how to move away from shame, that it's not an integral part of the relationship so that trust is building. Usually if there's full trust, there's no shame. Knowing Jesus Christ, there's no shame in that because there's full trust. I'm the way, the truth, and the life. So truth is the sandwich, right? The meat right in the middle of the sandwich. And therefore, when truth arises, there's health and there's trust. So we're talking a little bit about how much information to share. Denise, you had mentioned that you were talking about the betrayed, of course. You both were helping us with two different places in this process. And you said it is helpful to give basic information. So when you're volunteering full information, not staggered information, which is typical of, you even described that. Aaron, you talked about this idea where people can not give full truth. Like I think you were illustrating you and your wife, and I think Melinda had, Dr. Reinke, she had asked about the what you brought home and the groceries, and I think it was milk or whatever it might be. But there's a tendency for us to all do what Adam and Eve did, and Adam point at someone else and, in other words, not take responsibility. So this idea of basic is helpful, details are kind of devilish, or you said the devil. I think that's what you were saying.
The devil is in the details, yeah.
The devil, I always get everything wrong tonight, aren't I? You have to kind of get me corrected here. But the devil's in the details, is that what I was hearing? So when we talk about that, let's talk about how much information to share and how do you process that? Full disclosure. So what is full disclosure? Could you give us an illustration? Of course, not a person that we couldn't identify anything about the person, but what would that mean to disclose and say somebody's even listening to this in their own private world a month from now, this particular video that we're producing here, and they listen to it and they go, well, how much should I disclose? And I think I really want to do that. I'm really in deep sin here and hurting my mate and hurting maybe my, it'd be children if there's children involved, just by virtue of the pornography in isolation. So what would you say to someone that would be asking that kind of question?
Well, generally, it's just really basic information, something like from, this time to this time, I was involved in an extramarital affair. I had unprotected sex X amount of times, that kind of very basic information. So too much information would be, I took her here, I bought her this, I called her this name, this was my little, pet name for her. Those kinds of things just rent space in the brain. And I will tell you that these relationships often heal, especially if you're dealing with two believers. The relationships heal, but what doesn't heal, what's really hard, is the trauma from all those details. So oftentimes the betrayed end up spending a lot of extra time in therapy with me because they got too many details. Did that answer your question?
Yeah, that is it's a really tender piece, because there's a tendency for the betrayed to say, I have to know more details. I can't get my arms around this. What do you do with a patient who says that, a client who's saying, I want to ask, him or her, I want to ask more more questions. There's this almost compulsion to ask more questions because I'm not getting satisfied in the sense of having enough information to be able to fully think it through or process it. What do you do with that?
Often the root of that is that they're trying to make sense out of something that is really senseless. And so they think if they get more information, somehow they're going to understand why this happened. But it's really a senseless act. And it doesn't make sense. And often the betrayed is understandably concerned about, well, what is it about me that made you go and do this? So if it's a guy, he's thinking, you know, gosh, maybe I don't provide enough. And maybe she's dissatisfied with our lifestyle, or, you know, these are kind of the ways in which men often think. On the other hand, for women, and these are wild generalizations, okay, I get it. But often for women, it's, you know, well, maybe it's I've gained some weight since the 3 children, and maybe I'm not as pretty as I used to be, or maybe I'm not, maybe this or maybe that, and they're trying to somehow, through the details that are shared, answer some of those questions for themselves. And so, those are a couple of reasons why I think people ask a lot of those questions. But I will tell you, it's really, really clear that sometimes just the smallest detail, and I know people make decisions for themselves about how much to share, but here's an exception where you have to share more information. If the betrayer has an affair and is involved with someone that his wife or spouse knows, you have to disclose the name that person. You have to. Because it is completely irrational for the wife to go through life, maybe go to church or whatever, and interact with this person that they don't even know has had this affair with their husband or wife. I mean, that's absolutely ridiculous. She has to know, or he has to know, that information. But often, if it's just an anonymous experience, and gosh, you don't even know the person's name, or it's just there's no emotional connection, and they still want to know all this information, and it just can, you know, work against the person so quickly.
Yeah, it's almost an element of humiliation, the difference between perhaps shame and humiliation. I've had patients who withhold that, and then it can be almost impossible to help the couple work through this. Because the way you described it, if, let's say, she found out later, a year later, they're working toward trust, they're building trust, the couple, the male in this case, who betrayed the marriage, and then it staggers. In other words, it comes out later that it was this particular female, and they've been in the same community, whatever that community is. That humiliation is so devastating, it goes beyond shame, I believe. So it's really important. That's a very good point to say. This next question ties into what we are discussing at this moment. And this is from a text question. What do you do if you suspect your wife, who has betrayed you, of having repressed sexual abuse when young, which is not really recognized by her or buried, and she's too afraid to confront the possibility, but something is blocking full expression? I think the question, I'm just reading the questions as they come up to me here, is what do you do if you suspect your wife, who has betrayed you, of having repressed sexual abuse when the person was young? And so I believe I understand the question, that she's not able to fully express intimacy with her husband due to the earlier trauma. So we have...
And it sounds like from that question that it was the wife in this case that had the affair. Is that what it said?
Who has betrayed you? but it's stated in a way having repressed sexual abuse when young. So it's not clear. It's
Okay,
not
so
clear, but let's
either
assume
way.
so. Yeah.
Either way.
Yeah, either way.
You want to start, Denise?
You go.
Okay, yeah, all right, so first of all, I get this like right off the bat from just about every guy that I work with, that you know what, he begins to take some level of responsibility, but then, I shouldn't say every guy, because it's not every guy, but a lot, it's a subtle way of blaming his wife, okay? And we can be very, very subtle and very sophisticated in the way that we blame her. Well, you know, she grew up in a bad family, and she never really understood how to make me feel like a man, or this or that, and so maybe some of that is true. Okay, I say usually, not quite this flippantly usually, but I say, well, so what? What does that have to do with the work that you have to do? And even if she was like cold towards you sexually or in any other way, you having an affair or you doing the porn or whatever it is not a good response to that kind of a situation. You should have been smarter in the way that you dealt with the problem that was in your marriage, okay? But there's two phases to this treatment. First phase is we have to deal with the betrayal, and we have to deal with it really thoroughly, and you have to take responsibility for that. And then secondly, we have to work on other things that may be a part of the whole picture, and she has to work on her side, and you have to work on your side. And hopefully she's in some treatment where she's getting some help with not just how to get through the betrayal, but then anything else that might be a part of her history.
This next question helps us in a different way. I'll pull this up here. And this is a very common one that I hear in my work with couples that are working on trust. They want to build trust. They want to move forward. And the question is, my husband has been recovering from sexual addiction for several years, and when he goes away on a business trip and there's a TV in his hotel room, I feel a little anxious. What steps can I take to help relieve my anxiety, and what steps can he take to continue to rebuild trust in our relationship?
That is really easy. I mean, any of you could answer that question, right? What could he do? Yeah, call in advance to the hotel and have them remove the TV,
Yes.
or have them block all the channels and so
Yes.
forth. And it's really important, this is a good illustration, it's really important for the guys to, or the women, whatever the case might be, to do a lot of that kind of proactive thinking on their own instead of waiting for their wife to give them ideas about what they need to do.
Yeah.
Because as you come up with it for yourself, then it helps her to see that, wow, he's changing the way he's thinking. He's thinking of not just himself, but of me and of our relationship.
That's hard for people to do, particularly a male. Now, if it was inverted, the female would quickly, I'm a male, so I think I can say this, but the female would quickly think ahead. If I'm going to that room, you know, I betrayed my husband, I need to do that, because women tend to think more comprehensively. They go between the two hemispheres more readily by biology alone. So they will think that way, whereas males don't. Think about it this way. Even a healthy couple, the male has to take the initiative to actually plan a date with his wife. And most of us as males, that's a hard job to do. We don't tend to think of that. If she would just tell me who I should call, at what time should I call, and how I would plan it, I would easily do it, right? Now, I'm trying to make fun of men, but we don't tend to think that way. So, Aaron, what you're saying is really important. It's one of the more difficult things I find with the couples with whom I'm privileged to work with, that the male would begin to take that initiative, like asking the question, when do you get most nervous? The male asking his wife, he's betrayed his wife. When do you get the most nervous? And she might say, it's really 5 minutes after you leave the house if I'm still here. Okay, so let's get creative. What would you do, male? You know the male, John, let's just use John. If this is the case, you would ask your wife what would be helpful at that point. And invite her to say, well, it might be helpful, pull over to the side and just text and tell me where you are, or we'll put the monitor on, which we can do with all of our phones, and she could follow where I am. But what it's doing is, you're saying when we take initiative, we build trust. And that's what I'm hearing you say, is in this idea of rebuilding, it's being consistent. It's like predictable parenting. Some of the best parents on the planet are predictable. The child already knows how the parent is going to respond, not react, but respond to their request or what they want. So it's predictable, and predictability creates trust. And that's the point that we're trying to suggest here. And it's a very, very good point. It can be very difficult for males to do this, but it can be one of the more profound trust-building moments in the relationship. Any other thoughts that you all have?
Yeah, for partners, we usually ask the partners to use iMessages and say something like, "Gosh, it's about a week away till you go on your next business trip, and I'm starting to feel some anxiety building because, I know you're going to have that TV in your room, and I'm fearful that you might be tempted to look at porn." So partners need to be able to use those iMessages and say that, but stop short of parenting and stop short of saying, here's what I want you to do. I want you to go to the front desk and have them turn that off. You don't want to do that. You want to use your iMessages and tell them what you're feeling. Let them hear what you're feeling and help you. Work together as a couple, again, to create safety for yourselves. That's the whole goal, working together.
That is so important, isn't it? Because it's separating the idea of experience and my perception from my feelings. And oftentimes the person who's betrayed wants to change the other person's perception, so they cut them off. They don't listen to their core feelings. Like, when this happened, I felt scared, embarrassed, afraid. And validating those core feelings, that softens the relationship. Our tendency is, because of the embarrassment, the chagrin, the shame perhaps, is to stop. No, that's not correct. This is really what happened. That doesn't help, because it creates distrust, because you're not validating the core feeling and feelings of the other person. I've used this illustration so many times. Jesus illustrated this often in the New Testament. He would ask the obvious. So the person's blind, and he asked, what would you like for me to do for you? He used invitational language. And I'm sure the disciples said, Jesus, he's blind. I think he wants to see, and you can heal him. Why not do it? I'm not sure they said that, but I'm just adding that in for a little bit of color here. But the point is that Jesus was very, very respectful of the person's core feelings, first and foremost. So if you validate that other person's feelings, both the betrayer and the betrayed, you will move toward much more trust. And I think that's what I was hearing you refer to.
Yeah.
Yes, you reframed that beautifully, Don.
Oh, thank you. Refrain. Of course, now refrain is, reframe is a wonderful thing. You know what? It's really a psychobabble concept. Not that you said psychobabble, but the idea of reframe is you hear what someone says, and then you reframe it back. We do that as therapists all the time. That's what I think you were teasing me a little bit. So, and that can be helpful in a relationship. So, do I hear what you're saying? So you're really saying this. You would like for me to pull over 5 minutes after I leave the house and text you. Or maybe call you. Yes, that's really what I'm asking. Well, I will try to do that. How often do you want me to do that? And you ask these invitationally based languaged questions, which can open up lots of trust, because that shows that you really care about what the other person's feeling and what their core, I think you were saying, core feelings are. Right. Well, as we wind down here today, we have just a few minutes left, and I wanted to ask you, anything else you would like to add? If you could say something to our audience here, and then it's being live streamed, so there are many, many people who are listening, and then the video later will be produced. What would you want to say to someone as we bring this to a close?
I would like to say that sexual betrayal is a big, big problem in our society, and it's a huge problem in a lot of relationships. But I want you to get this, that in my life, God used it as an opportunity for me to grow and to change and develop into a man that I never dreamed I could become. And our relationship went from a pretty good relationship, actually, to a great relationship over time, as I really invested in making changes in my own personal life.
Thank you. Anything for you, Denise, as we get ready to close?
Yeah, so I would like to say that in our culture, there's such a large emphasis on beauty and sexuality, and oftentimes the partners that I work with come in and they beat themselves up because they don't look like the people on the magazines do at the checkout counter. And so they somehow feel that if they could be more, taller, more blonde, more thin, more, more large-chested, maybe, way more, whatever, more something, that this wouldn't have happened. And nothing could be further from the truth, right? It's. I think a lot of this is the culture that we live in. And so work on the inner self, work on strengthening yourself. Don't go out and get a bust job. I've seen a lot of patients that come in and they say, I'm going to get plastic surgery. That's not the solution. This has nothing to do with how you look. This has something to do with what your partner's dealing with. Don't take it personal in that sense, but use it as a springboard to draw closer to God and develop some deeper qualities in yourself.
Thank you. Would you join me in thanking both Denise and Aaron joining us this evening with their spectacular presentation? Thank you both very much. We are so pleased that you have been here. We have over 114 presentations we've done here at Skyline Church. My therapist says in October, we have a beloved Dr. Ben Lim, who is well known in San Diego, now a emeriti professor from Bethel Seminary, and it will be developing and maintaining psychological wellness. So we look forward to you joining us in October for that wonderful presentation. We're going to have a word of prayer, thanking God for His presence here as He goes with you and us, and thank Him for being with us. Let's pray. Heavenly Father, what a privilege it is to be here together. You have promised where 2 or 3 gathered together in the name of Jesus. We started today's session asking for your blessing. We end with your blessing, that where 2 or 3 are gathered together in your name, that you are present, and you want miracles to happen. You are a God of miracles. Thanks be to God for miracles. And we pray your blessing upon each person that is in the auditorium, listening by live streaming, or perhaps in the leisure of their home or place of work, listening to this broadcast at a later time through video production, that you most importantly would speak your truth into their lives, and truth heals. And we thank you. You are the way, the truth, and the life. Thank you so much for your presence. We pray this now in the precious name of Jesus Christ. Amen. Thank you again for coming to My Therapist Says. Have a good evening.